The 60th session of the Senate in the first regular session of the 17th Congress is hereby called to order. Senator Loren Legarda will lead us in prayer.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for giving us this day to work and be of service to our countrymen. You said that righteousness elevates a nation to greatness. Grant us, O Lord, righteous judgment as we make moral and ethical decisions for the good of the Filipino people. Fill our hearts with compassion for the weak, courage in the face of diversity, wisdom to make upright decisions, and patience to follow the road you've taken. For all the issues that may divide us and for all the uncertainties that come our way, we pray that your Spirit will dwell among us and enlighten us to fulfill your call to love one another as you have loved us. In these challenging times, let us trust in your promise when you said, "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Senator Legarda. Majority Leader, should we suspend session for a while?
So I move to suspend the session, Mr.
Session is
President.
suspended. Si Cheese, no? Sa likod. 8 na.
Binigay siya yung bata.
Ang sabi ni Senator Soto. Sige. Ano meron? Saan ini? Okay na? Pakitanong lang. Session is resumed. Secretary, please call the roll.
Roll call of members. The Honorable Senators Angara, Aquino, Binay, Cayetano, De Lima, Drilon, Ejercito, Escudero, Gatchalian, Gordon, Honasan, Hontiveros, Lacson, Ligarda, Pacquiao, Pangilinan, Po, Recto, Soto, Trillanes, Villanueva, Villar, Soberi, Senate President Pimentel.
Present si Gordon, si Angara din.
Gordon, President.
Angara.
Angara.
Okay. Si Gordon, okay na. Meron ba tinuturo pa siya? Sino to? Si JV? Okay, so JV is present. So with 17 senators present, the chair declares the presence of a quorum. Majority Leader?
Mr. President, I move that we defer the approval of the journal of the 59th session, Tuesday, February 17, at a later hour.
Is there an objection? There being a motion is approved.
We'd like to acknowledge guests in the gallery, Mr. President, visiting the Senate. The students of the College of Immaculate Conception, Cabanatuan City, headed by Renato Bautista and Bessie Galang. The guests of Senator Delon, students from Keys School, headed by Ms. Stephanie Barredo, Keys School, Manila, accompanied by their teachers, Monica Javier, Lea C., Gray de Guzman, Jean Bautista, 23 grade 6 students, Mr. President. And the Vice Governor of Misamis Oriental, Vice Governor Joy Pilaes, and former board members Gerald Ortiz and of Quezon Province, Mr. President. Would like to welcome them to the Senate.
Welcome to all of our guests. Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat.
Mr. President, I move that we proceed with the reference of business.
Is there any objection? Hearing none, motion is approved. Secretary?
Bills on first, bills on first reading. 1316, an act exempting the Bureau of Internal Revenue from the coverage of Republic Act number 6758, otherwise known as the Compensation and Position Classification Act of 1989 as amended, and for other purposes by Senator Recto.
Referred to the Committees on Ways and Means, Civil Service, Government Reorganization and Professional Regulation, and Finance.
Resolution number 284, commending Jerwin Angcajas for winning IBP World Super Flyweight title in Macau. Senator Manuel Manny Pacquiao.
To the Committee on Rules,
Committee report number 35 submitted by the Committee on Labor, Employment, and Human Resources Development on Senate Bill number 209, introduced by Senator Joel Villanueva, entitled An Act Declaring the 25th day of August of every year as the National Tech Voc Day, recommending its approval without amendment. Senator Joel Villanueva.
to the calendar for ordinary business,
Committee report number 36 submitted by the Committee on Public Services on House Bill number 4631, introduced by Representative Enverga et al., entitled An Act Renewing for Another 25 Years the franchise granted to Republic Broadcasting System Incorporated, presently known as GMA Network Incorporated, amending for the purpose Republic Act 7252, entitled An Act Granting the Republic Broadcasting System Incorporated a franchise to construct, install, operate, and maintain radio and television broadcasting stations in the Philippines, recommending its approval with amendments. Senator Grace Poe.
to the calendar for ordinary business.
Mr. President.
Should we proceed to the additional reference of business?
Yes, please, the additional reference of business.
Secretary,
Just,
please
two of
proceed.
them.
One three 17, entitled An Act Strengthening Compliance with Occupational Safety and Health Standards and Providing Penalties for Violations thereof. Senator Joel Villanueva.
To the Committee on Labor, Employment, and Human Resources Development,
1318, an act instituting a Philippine labor force competencies, competitiveness program, and establishing free access to technical and vocational training programs. Senator Joel Villanueva.
to the Committees on Labor, Employment, and Human Resources Development, Education, Arts and Culture, and Finance. Majority Leader?
Mr. President, maybe I be allowed for a very short manifestation. A request, actually, to the chairman of the Committee on Justice. It's a matter of public interest, Mr. President.
Please go ahead,
Yes.
Majority Leader.
Yesterday, during the hearing of the Committee on Justice and Human Rights, one of the resource persons, I believe it was one of the representatives of Amnesty International, presented a copy of the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, aiming at the abolition of the death penalty. And after that, the hearing was suspended. I think this is one of the main reasons for that. Now, Mr. President, according to the records that they have brought out, this was adopted and proclaimed by the General Assembly December 15, 1989, perhaps of that second optional protocol. Now, it was signed by the Philippines, according to them, in September 20, 2006. And then the Philippines submitted the instrument of ratification to the United Nations on November 20, 2007. May we request the chairman of the Committee on Justice to ask who signed the September 20, 2016 records of the Philippines, and also 2006, signed by the Philippines. By who, Mr. President? And then the Philippines submitted instrument of ratification to the UN. By who, Mr. President? We checked with the Senate protocol. They do not have a copy. Therefore, it was not the Senate. They are now checking in the entire records of the Senate, and we are asking for certification from the Senate protocol that there is no such instrument of ratification from the Senate. So we would like the Committee on Justice to find out whether this is true or not, so that we can perhaps go on with the suspension or the hearing, Mr. President. Just an appeal to the Committee on Justice and Human Rights, Mr. President.
I think Senator Gordon is going to respond. Senator Gordon is recognized.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, in the hearing yesterday, this matter was presented and it became a supervening event that we have to resolve. And that is why reference was given to the Secretary of Justice so that he can give us, by his research, whether in fact there was a ratification validly done, or whether in fact, if there was such a ratification, we are practically handcuffed from doing anything more about the death penalty. Because obviously we're all aware that when a country signs a treaty and unilaterally comes back out of its commitments, it becomes a very bad show for our country. It's very important that the whole world respects us. Besides, in the Constitution, we have to be extremely careful because it's very clear that, among others, we renounce war as an instrument of national policy, but we adhere to the fact that all as part of internationally accepted principles, all matters of treaties and conventions that have been properly ratified. Having said that, Mr. President, we're awaiting that. And while we're at this point, I'd like to stand on a matter briefly of collective privilege. And I believe that in the Senate, we must have a list of all bills or all treaties that have been ratified. That way, it will save us time and possible embarrassment if at any time we have an agreement or we have a hearing, we can draw on the Senate staff to look at ratification. So it really is part of our Congress. As you know, the U.S. Library of Congress does these things so that it will save time for its members to research, because it has all the laws, it has practically all records of the world in there. It becomes a very great source of information. So my position, Mr. President, with all due respect, and I hope the whole Senate will really support it, is that in matters involving international agreements or treaties that the Senate has a ready file that can be given to any member who so desire or who needs it, or in the middle of a committee, we can immediately be informed, so we will not be reliant upon anybody else. So move, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Legarda.
Very good. Senator Gordon, Mr. President, is absolutely correct. May we request the Committee on Foreign Relations and the other committees to help out, and the Secretariat, that every senator will have a hard and an e-copy of every convention, treaty, and similar agreements that the Philippine government has entered into, whether it is an executive agreement or a treaty concurred in by the Senate even before or during our tenure, so that we are not confused and we do not enact laws or even hold hearings which contravene the essence of these treaties. An example, for example, is the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. I stumbled upon the information when I was holding, I think, a Finance Committee hearing, when I saw a budget allocation for our membership in the AIIB. Only to realize that we, as founding member, would have lost our opportunity to be a founding member if we did not ratify it in Malacanang and transmitted to us on time and concurred in the ratification. And without trying to pat my back on the shoulder, but maybe I will, I helped shepherd it, and you know that. In fact, It was timely because the President was visiting China, and I called the Executive Secretary and PMS. Madaliin nyo, maganda para pagpunta ni Pangulong Duterte sa bansang China ay naratipika na ang AIIB. It was not transmitted on time, and it was transmitted after, but that's still fine. But we were able to do that. We conducted a hearing. We were able to sponsor it. It was passed after 3 or 4 hours of interpolation, half of which was the Gordon interpolation. That's fine. So what I'm saying, Mr. President, and if we did not finish it last year, we would have lost the chance of being a founding member. And to my mind, there are differences of being a founding member and not a founding member. I am not blaming any committee or any person. All I'm saying is that it would be instructional, helpful, not just for the Senate, but the whole government, so that we are advised, because we don't have a Wikipedia in our minds of all treaties that we have entered into. Yes, but to please make it accessible to every senator, depending on chairman. All treaties pertaining to justice, all treaties pertaining to the environment, agriculture, etc. There's so much. There's just so many. And so this confusion over the treaty that would therefore contradict any bill filed on the reimposition of a death penalty could be well studied as well. So that's just my intervention, my
Anyway.
concurrence to the suggestion of Senator Gordon, which brings me to my last point.
Mr. President, my request is simple. Ba't umahaba usapan?
Hindi.
Sabi ko lang, tingnan natin yung claim.
Oh, I'm not
Sino
finished.
nag-sign? September 20, 2016. Sino pumirma? Sabi lang nung AI ito eh. Oh, asan yung kopya ng instrument of ratification? Sinabit
before
pa
we
sa
go-
UN. Wala ang Senate
yes.
eh. Senate ang nag-ratify based on the 1986 Constitution, 87
Okay.
87 Constitution.
Teka, mapunta
Simple
muna
na
ako sa
request
Paris
ko. My
Agreement.
request is simple for the Justice Committee to take a look and find out the answers to these 2 points. That's all. Hindi kailangan
Yes,
usapan natin.
Okay, may I say my last point?
Yes, ma'am.
I therefore may I urge the executive, the office of the president, to transmit to the Senate, to the Committee on Foreign Relations, the Paris Agreement. We've been waiting from last year, Mr. President. The certificates of concurrence, more than 30, I think 32 or 33, have been submitted by all agencies of government. Again, tumulong na po ako pagtatawag kasi hindi po ginagawa ng Climate Change Commission ang kanilang tungkulin sa pagtawag sa lahat o nahihirapan sila. Tumulong na rin po tayo sa DFA. Finally, a week or 2 ago, in my presence, Secretary Yasay handed it to Deputy Executive Secretary Attorney Maynard Guevara. So it's with Malacanang. How long will it take? I would urge, request, appeal to your leadership, Mr. President, to ask them to transmit it to us so that we can hear it. The chairman of Foreign Relations is Senator Cayetano. He already told me that he wanted to hear it, or perhaps assign the subcommittee to someone who's willing to sponsor it. Maybe me, maybe not me, magtutulungan tayo, and then discuss it on the floor and ratify it. Because again, if we don't concur in its ratification and complete the ratification process this year, we will be an observer in the next COP. In Marrakesh, we were not able to influence any discussions because we did not ratify it, because we were an observer. So, the whole slow grinding bureaucracy always leaves us at the sidelines of discussions because of our inefficiency in the bureaucracy. So pardon me, Mr. President, for shouting at the mic. It's just that I'm passionate about these things, and we really need to well oil our bureaucracy and just speedily discuss things. I am certain many of our colleagues would agree with me. Thank you, Mr. President.
What's the pleasure of Senator Gordon?
Yes, Mr. President, I raised this matter as a matter of collective privilege. If I believe it doesn't really have to be done that way. The Secretary of the Senate is the keeper of all records. And that is why it is important that whenever we change the Secretary of the Senate, there should be a proper turnover of all the records in the possession of the Senate, particularly matters like ratification of treaties, because the Constitution provides that we are the agency of the government that can ratify or concur in treaties. So I think it's important that at the flick of a finger or at the jabbing of a computer, we can actually get the information right away. So, Mr. President, I would like to reiterate my request that we have this. And thank you to Senator Soto for raising this matter. I've already instructed our committee secretary to touch base with the Committee on Justice, and now we will include the Committee on Foreign Affairs. The problem is they may not have those records again because we're not famous for keeping records like the Germans. So we have to really conduct this operation in the Senate, because I think primary responsibility is lodged in the Secretary of the Senate, because he has to certify that on this day, this treaty was ratified and concurred in by the Senate. Thank you, Mr. President.
The chair can identify two issues arising from the exchanges. So there is now a request, and I'm directing the Secretariat to fulfill the request. Number one, for a list of all the treaties and international agreements concurred in by the Senate. We have the data. It's a matter of for the proper Senate office to inform all the senators in writing. And then the specific issue raised by Senator Soto is actually a question of fact, whether the Philippines is a party to the Mother Convention, to the first optional protocol, and to the second optional protocol. So of the International Convention on Political and Civil Rights. So anyway, the Secretariat is directed to also answer in writing Senator Soto and copy furnish all the senators regarding that question of fact. And if the answer is we are a party, please attach documentary proof. That is, I think that is the request of the majority leader, the documentary proof also. So, okay, so can we proceed?
Meron. No, main treaty, 1989.
Can we proceed, Majority
Yes,
Leader?
Mr. President, I move to resume consideration of Senate Bill 1311 under Committee Report 33.
Is there any objection? There being none, the motion is approved.
Mr. President, yesterday we started the sponsorship on Senate Bill 1311, or the Ease of Doing Business Act of 2017. However, the Minority Leader likewise made a reservation to deliver a co-sponsored speech today. May I move for a 1-minute suspension, Mr. President?
There being no objection, session is suspended. Green, ito ang problema. Kinisido.
That's why kailangan ko ng legislature or parliament. So, if this agreement is concerned with death penalties and executive agreement, we can we sabi nila.
Session is resumed.
Thank you. Mr. President, I now move to recognize the Minority Leader, Senator Ralph Recto, for his co-sponsorship speech on Senate Bill 1311, the Ease of Doing Business Act of 2017.
Senator Recto is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Majority Leader. Mr. President, my dear colleagues, magandang hapon po. The bill is pretty straightforward, so instead of reiterating its provisions, may I just describe the social context, the government culture, and the business atmosphere which makes its passage urgent. Red tape is an overdiagnosed but undertreated disease. Instead of being mitigated, it has metastasized all over the bureaucracy. And that is what we get for trying to cure it with rhetoric instead of reforms. And judging by how the world sees us, our vitals have gone from bad to worse. In the 2016-2017 edition of the Global Competitiveness Index of the World Economic Forum, we rank 137th out of 138 economies in the number of procedures to start a business. Pangalawa sa kulelat. And 115th as to the length of time to start one. In the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business, we have gone down 4 ranks, from number 95 in 2015 to 99 in 2017, out of 190 economies. It is, however, the subsets of these report cards which tell us of our biggest problems. In the 2015 report of the World Bank, we are 161st in starting a business, 127th in ease in paying taxes, 115th in the paperwork to employ workers. In the 2017 ranking by World Bank, we are 171st in starting a business, 85th in dealing with construction permits, 112th in registering a property. In many of these metrics, failed states like Afghanistan are ranked higher than us. The 7 countries covered by Trump's immigration ban even fared better. As we are still nursing a Miss Universe hangover, let me give you another vital statistic, which depict not the beauty of our system, but its defects. 34, 35, 36. 34 days to start a business, 35 days to register a property, 36 days spent in a year to pay taxes. To those who would dismiss these numbers as alternative facts, then perhaps the kilometric queues in getting government licenses and documents would convince you. Incensed at the daily sight of Promdies lining up overnight to apply for a passport in a mall in his native city, even President Digong had rallied against red tape. But this should anger us more. Red tape costs small businesses 140 billion in lost economic opportunities yearly. Digong must be reminded that red tape is a bigger problem than the Reds. So what's the culprit of all of this? The Byzantine maze of regulations in a balkanized bureaucracy. If you're a freelance writer, you get a business permit, but to get one, you need a fire clearance. When you're still freeloading at your parents' home and you do your work in that corporate headquarters of the Facebook generation called Starbucks. Pag na-approve ang business permit, magbabayad ka ng plaka na may Photoshop picture ni Mayor, habang ang plaka ng views mo, taon nang wala. Kung nagkataong pasok ka sa VAT bracket, you have to make 36 annual pilgrimages to the BIR. Walk-in ka sa casa with only your handsome face as collateral. In 72 hours, your 1 million car loan application will be approved. But go to Pag-ibig with a land title worth 2 million as collateral for a loan, half that amount, and it will take you weeks and tons of paperwork to get an approval. Ang kotse pwede mong itakbo, ang lupa hindi. If one senile coconut tree is in danger of collapsing into your roof, you cannot cut until you have a permit. And even if you have it, you can only do so with a registered chainsaw. Many small transactions require physical appearance. If you have a postage stamp size lot in the province, you cannot wire RPT payments, nor can you make advance payments for the subsequent years. In some local government units, the size of a business permit plate is as small as a chocolate bar, but in many others, it is as big as a cartolina. And I am glad that this is answered by a provision in this bill, which requires unified and standardized forms in all government offices, especially local governments. Mr. President, in getting government documents, we have to shorten the process, shrink the number of requirements and signatories, speed up the delivery, and price them in a way mandated by law to recover the cost in making them, but not to make a profit. If we demand premiums for prompt service, we must likewise give discounts for delays and slap those responsible with demerits. It says here that if an application does not get approved within a prescribed time, it gets automatically approved. Tama nga naman, kung ang pizza hindi dumating in 30 minutes, libre na. Bakit ang reimbursement ng bayad sa phantom plates, wala pa? We have to lengthen the validity of licenses, permits, passports, NSO clearances, and make them transactable online. If documents are not perishable items, why must they have short expiry dates? This brings me to another rule, which must be applicable nationwide. The multi-purpose use of clearances. For indeed, why must one be required to submit an original clearance to this office, to that office, and to the next, when it ought to be one size fits all? And I am happy to note again, Mr. President, that this bill, insofar as local permits are concerned, prohibits the duplication of required documents. Red tape is an equal opportunity oppressor, hitting businesses of all sizes. Big-ticket items like PPPs are not immune. Kaya para sa kanila, more one-stop shops and clear and unchanging rules ang kailangan. Minsan kasi ang transparency cost mas malaki pa sa moral hazards na iniiwasan. Example, MRT. We don't actually need laws to ease doing business or cut red tape. More relief can be given by simple acts than by republic acts. In airports, for example, why would travelers queue to pay travel tax when this can be embedded in the cost of the tickets? And if airlines are deputized as collecting agents, then compensate them. And I am sure that the cost would be lower than what we pay TIESA employees to manually issue the receipt and manually count the money. Adding more frontline personnel does not require legislation. Putting up portals do not require a congressional franchise. Mr. President, my dear colleagues, in fighting red tape, our objective is not only to promote ease in doing business, but more importantly, to make it easy for the government to reach its targets. By target, I do not refer to the people who are in the cross sights of the gun. You know what, Mr. President, the only tally we're making concerns body bags. While there are far more important numbers to track, the only national scoreboard we have today are deaths. What are the numbers that truly matter against which government's performance must be measured? These are poverty and employment. Between 2016 and 2022, the government said it will create 12 million jobs, or 2 million a year. Between 2016 and 2022, the government has also promised that it will graduate 7 million poor, or more than 1 million a year out of poverty. 2 million jobs a year plus 1 million liberated from poverty. So you ask me, what is the role of this bill in achieving those targets? Simple, Mr. President. Jobs can only be generated by businesses, which can only flourish, if not choke, by regulations. Why? Because nothing strangles Filipino exceptionalism and creativity more than countless and useless rules and regulations. The red tape yoke must be lifted for government to meet its other targets as well. It cannot be for local permits alone. We can exist with a bicameral legislature, but not with a bifurcated government, where documents are processed maybe fast in some LGUs, but move slower at the national level. Magbibigay ako ng dalawang halimbawa. We are about to enter a very taxing season. But to encourage tax obedience, we must simplify, shorten, and streamline tax payments. What I am saying is that the tax program must be predicated in eliminating red tape first. The truth is, taxpayers are willing to pay their dues if only it isn't cumbersome and complicated. Nowhere is this more evident than in the income tax return, which is 11 pages long, that one wonders if it is designed to extract financial data or your autobiography. Speaking of taxes, government must also increase the share of LGUs from the internal revenue collection from 40% to 50% or 50-50, hating kapatid. Because believe it or not, the pressure from a series of national government mandated salary increases is what is driving up local permit cost. Isang solution sa red tape ay ang pagdadagdag ng mga kawani. Pero maraming lokal na pamahalaan ang nagpapatupad ng hiring moratorium dahil nga lumolobo ang personal services expenses. Hindi nakakapagtaka kasi payroll costs of LGUs rose by 50% from 2010 to 2015. And their general services expense rose fivefold during the same period. Kaya nga ang pangamba ng iba, aanhin mo ang konting rekisitos kung kokonti naman ang bilang ng mga kawani na magproproseso nito. One more bad thing about red tape is that it deflates government spending. Scratch the surface of an unobligated appropriation, and you will find complex rules beneath. Thus, if we want to turbocharge the release of money, but in a manner which will not leave the government shortchanged, then let us slash the thicket of rules governing the use of funds. This is important because government spending impacts on the business environment. Public spending, if not a growth driver, is at least a growth influencer. When a road to a port used by exports does not get built because funds have been embargoed, is but one of many examples of how red tape-driven underspending dampens growth and reduces the velocity of government money. Mr. President, my dear colleagues, I am glad that this consolidated bill calls for the optimization of ICT in reducing red tape and promoting ease of doing business. There is no doubt that we must harness technology. In this selfie Facebook, and some say fake news capital of the world, permits, licenses, land titles should now be electronically applied for, processed, and issued. As I have often said, let us leave to the MRT the exclusive franchise of organizing long lines. But this would require reforms in the telecom sector, because what use is online application forms when it downloads pixel by pixel in Tetris speed? Mr. President, let me beg your indulgence if I have expanded the subject of my speech beyond the metes and bounds of the bill before us. My point is that there should be a comprehensive solution to red tape. For a problem so prevalent, there can never be a piecemeal approach nor a fragmentized cure. The ease of doing business should be enjoyed not just by business, but even by government offices. Intra-agency transactions, especially in public bidding, the release and utilization of funds should be seamless as well. So I hope that this bill is just our maiden salvo against red tape and that more of its kind are forthcoming. Before I close, let me make this observation. As a proponent of small but smart government, I have my reservations as well to the idea of creating another layer of bureaucracy for the purported reason of making the bureaucracy more efficient. It seems that whenever we are confronted by a problem, we seem so unable to resist the temptation of solving it by creating a commission to handle the job that it has become an automatic reflex. Sa halip na isang bagong komisyon, hindi ba pwede na isang interagency committee na lang na kinabibilangan ng mga kalihim na may direktang kaugnayan sa pagtanggal ng red tape? This is akin to passing a law, reducing the number of rules, only to implement it through an IRR longer and more voluminous than the rules to be abolished. Nonetheless, I support this measure, proud to be its principal author, and I call for its immediate approval, of course, with amendments. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Recto.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
before I move for the suspension of Senate Bill 1311, because there are many students in the gallery, the Minority Leader has mentioned the term or the phrase red tape perhaps a dozen times. So perhaps we can ask Senator Frank Drilon, the President Pro Tem, to give a trivia on where red tape emanated from, Mr. President.
Yeah, if there's no objection, for the benefit of our young student guests, Senator Drilon is recognized.
I am sure, Mr. President, thank you very much. I am sure, Mr. President, that if we ask our colleagues one by one here, nobody could tell us why it is called red tape.
Yeah.
And I was asking the Majority Leader that if he recalls, about 10 years ago, we were invited to the British Parliament as guests from the Philippine Senate. And in the course of the orientation, there were a few phrases which they briefed us on as originating from the parliamentary practice in England. First, the word lobby. We know of lobby as referring to groups who would pressure members of Congress to do this or to do that. That originated, Mr. President, from the lobby of the British Parliament, where the constituents of the British parliamentarians would wait for their representatives and talk to them about matters pending in Parliament. Red tape, Mr. President, refers, as we know it, to a process wherein the documents are routed from one office to the other until final approval. At final approval, the document is wrapped in red tape. That is why it is called red tape. That's the trivia for this afternoon. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Drilon.
And indeed, we saw the many documents that were cramped on one side of the British Parliament, all with red
So
tape, Mr. President.
you
Yes,
were
we
with-
saw it.
You were in the
President,
trip?
one more.
Majority
Yeah,
Leader?
I was in the same trip, yes.
One more trivia.
Yes, sir.
Senator Gatsalian asked me, what about pork barrel? Where did it come from? Pork barrel, Mr. President, came from the practice in America, wherein the parliament, the members of Congress, when they go home to their districts, would place pork in a barrel for their slaves. And therefore, the connotation was that they bring their constituents the benefits and the goodies for the benefit of their constituents, and they placed pork in the barrel to preserve the pork during those times. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Lacson?
Senator Lacson, Mr. President.
A little correction, Mr. President.
Yes, sir.
The President pro tempore referred to the persons as members of Congress. No, they were white masters during the pre-Civil War days. That's just a little correction.
They were members of Congress, though, Mr. President.
Maybe some. Maybe some.
But generally, they were white masters. Mr.
Masters.
President. All right. Thank you, Mr. President. As you can see, what age can do.
A lot of trivia, but I move that the statement of the majority leader be stricken off the record.
I object, Mr. President.
It will be preserved in the records.
Mr. President, to give time to the other senators to study the proposed measure.
Senator Recto?
Mr. President, it's only now that I found out that the Senate President Pro Tem is an expert when it comes to red tape and pork barrel.
I move
the history.
to
As to the history
suspend,
thereof, yes.
to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 1311 under Committee Report Number 33, Mr. President.
Is there any objection? There being none, we suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 1311.
With the permission of the body, I move to transfer from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders. House Bill 4631 under Committee Report Number 36.
Any objection to the motion? There being none, so transferred.
Mr. President, I move to consider House Bill 4631 under Committee Report Number 36.
Any objection? There being none, we proceed to consider Senate Bill House Bill number
4631.
4631 under Committee Report number 36.
May we ask the Secretary to read the title of the measure?
House Bill.
An act renewing for another 25 years the franchise granted to Republic Broadcasting System Incorporated, presently known as DMA Network Incorporated, amending for the purpose Republic Act Number 7252 entitled An Act Granting the Republic Broadcasting System Incorporated a franchise to construct, install, operate, and maintain radio and television broadcasting stations in the Philippines.
Mr. President, to sponsor the measure, may we recognize the Chairman of the Committee on Public Services, Senator Grace Poe. Be recognized.
Senator Poe is recognized to sponsor the measure.
Good afternoon, Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, guests, magandang hapon po. This bill seeks to renew for another 25 years the legislative franchise granted to GMA Network in 1992 through Republic Act 7252. GMA Network is a Filipino institution. Since its humble beginnings as Republic Broadcasting System in 1950, it has grown to be one of the most respected media companies in the region. Through exemplary corporate governance, GMA Network has continued with and has proportionately increased its economic, cultural, and social contributions to our nation. The network is consistently one of the nation's top corporate taxpayers. As an economic enterprise, GMA Network is publicly listed and traded. It has 47 UHF and 41 VHF TV stations nationwide, together with FM stations and AM stations led by DZBB and DWLS. GMA Network is now global as it is viewed by Filipinos all over the world through its international channels. In the digital space, GMA's portal is one of the most visited Filipino websites. The network's output in news and public affairs, best known for its neutrality and impartiality, has resulted in numerous international and domestic awards. Some of these have in turn resulted in commendations from Congress, such as through House Resolution 787 and 6094, which were both unanimously adopted. Entertainment programming has likewise resulted in major awards here and abroad, with the common thread being that the network is considered a caretaker of core Filipino values. Notable as well are the network's efforts through its socio-civic arms to reach out and help the community. Kapwa Ko Mahal Ko and GMA's Kapuso Foundation have served as conduits for thousands of benefactors to bring medical assistance and other forms of aid to the less fortunate. In recent years, GMA Kapuso's Foundation also have efforts that have been expanded to include the building of housing units and schools, such as those for the Yolanda victims in Leyte and the Sendong victims in Iligan City. In the coming years, GMA Network aims to continue its efforts to maintain both the relevance and responsiveness of its news, public affairs, and entertainment programs to the growing and diversifying needs of the Filipino public. This, complemented by investments, the network is poised to make over the next few years as our country migrates towards digital terrestrial television, which will enhance the service GMA Network delivers to the public by improving both the picture and audio quality of its programs. With a view of that, GMA Network will continue its present course and trajectory. Immediate approval of this bill is earnestly sought. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Poe.
Mr. President, before I move for the suspension, although I am not an employee, nor do I receive any talent fees from the GMA network, a television program that I am involved in is contracted with the GMA. So I set this on the record for purposes of disclosure, Mr. President. For the record.
Yes, your manifestation has been noted.
Thank you,
and
Mr.
recorded.
President. With that, I move to suspend consideration of House Bill 4631 under Committee Report Number 36.
Is there any objection? There being none, we suspend consideration of House Bill number 4631.
We have a 1-minute suspension, Mr. President.
Session is suspended. Di ano muna? Pwede mo na mag-ano?
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
With the permission of the Chamber, I move to resume consideration of Senate Bill 1304 under Committee Report Number 28.
Is there an objection? There being none, Senate Bill number 1304 under Committee Report number 28 is now under consideration.
Mr. President, this is the proposed measure on free higher education for all act. The parliamentary status of the measure is that we are in the period of interpolation, so I move to recognize the sponsor, the Chairman of the Committee on Education, Arts, and Culture, Senator Bam Aquino, and to interpolate Senators Ejercito and then De Lima, Mr. President.
Senator Aquino as sponsor and Senator Ejercito as interpolator are both recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Majority Floor Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. If the sponsor is willing to answer some clarificatory questions.
Of course, Mr. President.
Thank you, the gentleman from Tarlac. Anyway, Mr. President, may we know from the sponsor if we have the data as to the maximum capacity of students per SUCs or ilang kaya yung porsyento na inaasa natin na tataas, no? How many percent do we foresee the enrollment to increase in the coming years, especially with the introduction of the free tuition fee?
Yes, Mr. President, this concern was raised by the private sector regarding a possible influx of students to the SUCs. But we do have a provision, Mr. President, in the bill that states that the SUCs need to disclose what their capacity is, and further increases in capacity must undergo approvals by CHED. So in short, Mr. President, we are looking at not really an influx because we set the capacity already. I'm predicting it will be very close to the current total enrollment, which is at 1.6, around 1.6 million students in our SUCs, Mr. President.
So, Mr. President, the SUCs will now, before this becomes to, this takes into effect, they have to declare already their capacities.
Yes, Mr. President. We will put a transitory provision, Mr. President, that we will consider their current enrollment as their capacity if they don't submit, no? But more or less, Mr. President, by putting that capacity check, we're staving off the possibility that there will be a massive influx of students.
Likewise, Mr. President, the reason I asked is that we want to make sure that this will be sustainable, that we would know that in the coming years, we would know how many or how many students will enroll, so that every budget season until not only in 2017 but in the coming years, that we will be ready.
Yes, Mr. President. By putting the capacity check, Mr. President, it will guide also the legislators in budgeting.
And likewise, we can easily estimate how much budget we should allocate for SUCs in the coming years.
Definitely, Mr. President.
Now, you have mentioned, Mr. President, that it was mentioned that there is a possibility that there would be an exodus to the SUCs, no? And I think it was already answered by yours previously. But my one concern that I would want to ask the sponsor, because I was going around and I was able to talk to some heads of some administrators of the SUCs. Their concern is that students who are enrolled in the SUCs might not value anymore their tertiary education since they do not have anything at stake. Parang sabi nila, baka hindi na ito pahalagahan, no? Kasi nga wala na silang kumbaga wala na silang stake, wala na silang binabayaran. Yun lang yung concern po lang.
Yes, Mr. President, just to clarify also, the tuition fee subsidy is only about 30% of their total cost. So in short, meron pa rin silang babayaran, which are your other fees, which depend on the particular course that they take. So hindi po totoo na wala silang babayaran, meron pa rin po silang babayaran. It's just that with the tuition fee subsidy, it will be about 30% less.
But won't the SUCs bite, since we will be allocating 8 billion, no? So that the tuition fees will be free, so to speak. But won't they charge so much in miscellaneous and other fees?
Yes, Mr. President,
What would be the safeguards?
Yes. Firstly, Mr. President, the 8 billion is what we allocated for the 2017 budget. But moving forward, this measure will cost about 16 billion. So parang yung 8 billion, Mr. President, is just for the first semester that we already budgeted for 2017. In any case, the increases in your other fees also needs CHED approval, Mr. President. So hindi basta-basta na mag-i-increase yung other fees. We also made the safeguard that we defined what is tuition, what is other fees, so that pag sinabi ho nating libre yung tuition fee, it refers to a specific set of expenses. So hindi ho pwede na just because na libre yung isa, dodoble naman yung
bawiin sa kabila.
bawiin sa kabila. And that defeats the purpose of the bill, Mr. President. And we will ask CHED, who of course is the regulator, to make sure that these increases do not happen arbitrarily or without cause.
And just 2 more points, Mr. President, regarding also the possible influx. Won't this affect the private higher educational institutions? They are just worried, no, because of this. They might have to close down because they might be losing some of their students to SUCs.
Well, Mr. President, we think that the capacity check will
solve
be
this?
enough of a reform to make sure that this won't happen. And secondly, Mr. President, and this is something that we keep on repeating to our private sector counterparts, is that there's already provision for scholarships in the Unifast Law, in the Scholar ng Bayan Act, all of these other scholarships which might be used in the private or the public schools is still there. So hindi naman ho natin binago yung mga previous scholarships or previous assistance that is provided to our students. Dagdag pa po ito dun sa mga nandyan na. So they shouldn't be worried that current benefits or current assistance that's provided to them will be deleted or taken out, Mr. President.
And last point, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, regarding overstaying students, because the reason why we want to give free tuition fee to the students of SUCs because they are poor but deserving students. But just in case, in a 4-year course, they do not graduate on time. For example, they failed some subjects. Will the 5th year, will they still be admitted as scholars? Will they still be free of tuition? Because there are others who are probably more deserving, who are poor, but they didn't get the chance to enter. So,
Mr. President, that's a good point. We can probably work with your office on an amendment to focus on that point. Definitely, Mr. President, we don't want yung 8 years na sa college tapos libre. Every year, we want them to finish on time so that more students can avail of the support. And we will be very happy, Mr. President, at the proper time to work on an amendment for that.
Thank you. Well, I will introduce an amendment regarding this, Mr. Sponsor and Mr. President. And before I end, I'd like to congratulate our sponsor, the gentleman from Tarlac, for pushing this. And I submit because I do believe, Mr. President, that if we want to lessen the poverty incidence, to lower the poverty incidence, one of the best investments is education. No, I do not believe in dole-outs because I think that you can only uplift the living conditions of the family if there's at least one graduate per family. So that's all, Mr. President. Congratulations. This will be a landmark legislation, and I fully support this. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Mr. President, for the record, the tuition fee is subject to CHED approval. The other fees are not, but since we're making tuition fee free, we're looking at making the other fees under the purview of CHED as well. Maybe we can introduce another amendment there, Mr. President, to make sure na hindi tumaas siya na bigla-bigla. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. But I agree that they still have to have some stake at least. At
Yes,
least
Mr.
they would
President.
value.
Definitely, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Erson. If the sponsor doesn't mind, can the chair has
Yes, Mr. President.
a question or a few questions? When we were discussing this during the budget process, we were estimating the total cost to provide free tuition in all SUCs. The figure was around 8 to
Or
9
9 billion, Mr.
to a high of 9, but never beyond 10 billion pesos. So how come I now hear a new figure of 16? So what happened during the time that we were estimating the total cost during the budget process? How come we were at the very low end?
Yes, Mr. President, we used the projected income as our basis for the 8 to 9 billion. But because of the receivables, Mr. President, that they don't factor in as part of the projected income because it comes at a later time, all of that, Mr. President, in total would be about 16 billion and not 9 billion,
16
Mr.
billion. No, but if the program is free tuition, so why are we looking at income and receivable? Why not? Can we not?
Because Mr. President, the SUCs looked at tuition as income before.
Okay.
And we used the number, projected income, we matched that number in our budget deliberations. While the actual number that we should have used should have been tuition fee per head, Mr. President. Average tuition fee per head.
Times capacity.
Yes, Mr. President.
Times capacity.
So in short, Mr. President, we can look at the 8.3 that's already there as our initial allocation for the first semester because it will be about half of the need, Mr. President.
Yes, but we were so excited that we were providing around 90% of the need.
Yes, Mr. President, and this points to another issue, Mr. President, with our government agencies, not just CHED, but the availability of data, the availability of pertinent data has been very difficult, Mr. President, from at least the agencies we've been working with on this bill. Sometimes, Mr. President, that data is contradictory. This is data we've asked for since July of last year, no? And it's only been lately, Mr. President, that we've been getting data now that the bill is moving. So, Mr. President, maybe another reform we can look at is the data gathering aspect because even then, Mr. President, it makes it difficult for us to have the best laws and the best policies without the right data.
Yeah, when I was Justice Committee Chair, I would ask for data and they could not give me accurate data.
Yes, Mr.
As
President.
to prisoners, as to number of women, etc., etc. So thank you, Senator.
Co-author of this bill because I believe that this measure, along with our K-12 program, will give our youth a fighting chance to compete in the global stage. And this is an investment on our future. So my first question is, does this bill in effect repeal by substitution or by implied repeal the Scholar ng Bayan Act?
No, Mr. President. We did not repeal any of the current benefits already available to our students, Mr. President. The STUFAP is still there. The Unifast law, which was passed in the last Congress, is still in effect. And the Scholar ng Bayan Act, Mr. President, is also still in effect. This is because, Mr. President, the Scholar ng Bayan Act actually has access to other fees as well, and not just tuition fees. No? So whoever can avail of the Scholar ng Bayan Act, Mr. President, is still up to receive more benefits than the free tuition that we have allotted for the SUCs.
Well, thank you for that clarification because under the Scholar ng Bayan Act, Republic Act 10648, it grants scholarship to the top 10.
Yes, and more than just tuition, Mr. President.
And more than just tuition.
Yes.
Unlike the proposed measure, this is more on just tuition.
Yes, Mr. President.
Full tuition for all the
students in SUCs, Mr.
in
President.
SUC. Now, talking about data or statistics, does the sponsor have any data on the admission rates of public school graduates to our SUCs? How many in terms of percentage came from public schools.
Mr. President,
and how many came from private high schools?
I'm sure you heard the discussion earlier with the Senate President, Mr. President. We don't have exactly that figure, but we could endeavor to receive it and submit to your office, Mr. President.
Because I guess the intent here, since this is really providing free tuition, then prioritized, the ones to be prioritized, although this envisions tuition for all, then we must, I'm sure that there are mechanisms or proposed mechanisms in the proposed measure that would ensure that really the needy ones would be benefited.
We put in one of the provisions, Mr. President, as a matter of principle, affirmative action, meaning to really focus on the disadvantaged and impoverished students. To be honest, Mr. President, we've come into some disagreement with CHED on this because they are looking at the poorest of the poor, only the poorest of the poor, when they look at our measure, Mr. President, because it is true, only about 8%, 7 to 8% of the poorest of the poor are able to get to SUCs. However, Mr. President, if you look at the demographics of the Philippines, and you go up to 70% of the population, and this 70% is still earning around 20,000 pesos per month per family, you will find that 80% of those in the SUCs come from these families, Mr. President. They don't fall under poorest of the poor anymore.
Yes.
But if you look at socioeconomic classes, this would be D and E, and maybe some parts of lower C. But definitely, Mr. President, a family whose monthly income, total monthly income is about 20,000 pesos, still needs the help and still needs the tuition fee subsidy. So this demographic, Mr. President, is really the target of our bill. Those who are poorest of the poor, and those who I think we can still consider poor in the Philippines, or those who need help. Now, we did put a provision, Mr. President, regarding affirmative action, meaning at the enrollment level to really focus on the disadvantaged students more. But we left it to the CHED, Mr. President, in the IRR to determine how that is done. That can be done in many ways. In other countries, Mr. President, they do it in different ways. The simplest would be during the test, you have to say how much your family income is, and that plays a factor in your enrollment eventually. So we did put that in, Mr. President, that aside from the test, which will determine your enrollment, there is leeway for affirmative action to make sure that indeed the majority of students in our SUCs are those who come from families that need help and support.
You just actually answered my third and supposedly the last question.
Oh, yeah,
about
thank you,
the
Mr.
affirmative action to increase enrollment from public school graduates. So it will be in a mechanism through an IRR from the CHED. Now, although under Section 4 of the bill, it says all SUCs shall create a mechanism to enable students with the financial capacity to pay for their education in the SUC to opt out of the tuition subsidy or to make a donation to the school.
Yes, Mr. President.
What is the rationale for this?
Mr. President, this was discussed lengthily by the senators who had been attending the workshops and the hearings. Because, Mr. President, one way to go is to do a check on every student who enrolls in the SUCs. And a number of the senators found that this might be cumbersome and eventually too expensive to also run if you were to check every single student. So instead, Mr. President, we came up with an opt-out mechanism where if you don't fall under the scope that this bill wishes to have, then you have the option to opt out and not accept the tuition fee subsidy and in effect pay the SUC for your tuition.
But I'm still trying to figure out whether in reality there would be those who would be availing
That
the
is the-
opt-out, because even if the parents are not that needy, they do not really belong to the poorer
Yes.
segment.
Mr. President,
Human nature would dictate that if it's free, it's free. So why opt out?
That's the question on human nature, Mr. President, which is a good question because there are some of us who feel that people will still be honest regarding their standing. Now, Mr. President, that particular opt-out mechanism is really, I guess you could say it was really created more for the schools like the University of the Philippines, where admittedly about 50% or more of their students really come from higher income families, yung really higher income families. There are a few more school systems which have that strange demographic, Mr. President, but you could say that apart from UP and MSU, and maybe Batangas State, and we can ask Senator Recto this later, there are very, very few SUCs which are really skewed towards families that can afford. So we are providing this mechanism, Mr. President, so those families can opt out of this provision of the government if they still get in, considering that there's affirmative action already in the enrollment procedure. So we're allowing that, Mr. President, a mechanism by which they can say, my family is actually doing better, and for this semester, for this year, I am opting out because I want this money to go to other students or to go back to the government.
And perhaps another mechanism would be to make sure that there are adequate recruitment programs in a public high schools.
We don't have that currently, Mr. President, but we will be happy to include an amendment to that effect.
That would be all. Thank you for the responses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Minority Leader will interpolate next week, so I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 1304 under Committee Report number 28.
Is there any objection? There being none, we suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 1304 under Committee Report number 28.
Thank you. Mr. President, I move to resume consideration of Senate Bill 1271 under Committee Report number 17.
Is there any objection? There being none, we resume consideration of Senate Bill number 1271 under Committee Report number 17.
Mr. President, this is the proposed measure on the Anti-Discrimination Act. The parliamentary status of the measure is that we are now in the period of interpolation. So I move to recognize the sponsor, Chairman of the Committee on Women, Children, Family Relations, and Gender Equality, Senator Risa Intiveros, and to interpolate yours truly, Mr. President.
Senator Ontiveros, as sponsor, is recognized, and to interpolate, Senator Soto is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Will the distinguished lady from Panay favor us with some answers to my questions and perhaps guide us through the intricacies of this proposed measure, Mr. President?
It would be an honor, Mr. President, for a bill that is actually not so intricate as it looks. I share the laugh of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, and for the record, I am in favor of the proposed measure. I will support any measure that will remove discrimination. But there are certain issues that we would want to be clarified on as far as this particular measure is concerned. So, my first question, Mr. President, is that is there any law or laws that Senate Bill 1271 wishes to amend?
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you for the good Majority Leader's expression of support for bills that seek to eliminate discrimination against persons. And in fact, Mr. President, and this is one of the non-intricate and one of the simple or essential features of this bill, that it seeks to amend no existing law. It simply seeks to provide, by force of law, the guarantees against discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity and expression that are already promised to every citizen of our country through various international human rights instruments and the Philippine Constitution itself.
Thank you for that answer, Mr. President. And I move on to Section 3, Paragraph A of your bill, which defines discrimination. Considering that discrimination is the very essence of this proposed measure, I find it necessary to really understand the definition provided therein. Your definition reads, Discrimination refers to any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on the grounds of sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. Hereinafter referred to as SOGIE. Do you pronounce that SOGI?
Yes, Mr. President,
SOGI.
SOGI.
And has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, access to, enjoyment, or exercise by all persons on an equal footing of all rights and freedoms. For purposes of this provision, the actual sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity of the person subjected to discrimination shall not be relevant for the purpose of determining whether an act of discrimination has been committed. My question, Mr. President, is what do you mean by, for purposes of this provision, the actual sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity of the person subjected to discrimination shall not be relevant for the purpose of determining whether an act of discrimination has been committed?
Thank you, Mr. President. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes,
Did
go
I
ahead, please,
interrupt
yes.
you? Thank you. This part of Section 3, letter A, means that if we are to determine under this law, this eventual law, as I hope, that an act of discrimination has been committed, it will not be relevant what the sex, the sexual orientation, or the gender identity of the person subject to discrimination is. And this relates, Mr. President, to an earlier discussion I had in interpellation by the gentlewoman from Bicol, the good Senator De Lima, when she asked if I would be willing at the proper time to accept an amendment to the title of the bill so that it would eventually refer not to acts of discrimination, but to the actual rights holders, meaning every individual of whatever sexual orientation and gender identity or expression. And I appreciated that earlier, I also appreciated that earlier question of Senator De Lima because it demonstrated her understanding as well that this bill is intended to protect against discrimination, not only, for example, the LGBTs, who historically and even by present statistics suffer the highest incidence of such acts of discrimination based on SOGI, but that this bill would actually eventually become a law, as I hope, that upholds the rights against discrimination or the freedom from discrimination of every individual, including
anyone,
straight,
of
etc.
anyone.
Yes, Mr. President, of everyone. So that this part of Section 3, letter A, means that the actual SOGI of the person discriminated against shall not be relevant for determining whether an act of discrimination has been committed. The focus, Mr. President, is on the discrimination itself, not on the actual identity or orientation of the victim. And this respects the inherent right or agency of the individual.
All right. Thank you for that, Mr. President. Moving on to Section 5. Section 5 of the proposed measure provides for some specific discriminatory practices that are unlawful or will be declared unlawful by this law, right? This bill. Its paragraph I provides that if the person to be subjected or forced to undertake any medical or psychological examination to determine or alter the person's SOGI is a minor, the approval of the appropriate family court is required. My question, Mr. President, is may I know the reason behind the such provision that it must be the family court? Why the court's approval? Why not the minor's parents or legal guardian as has been provided by existing laws?
Pardon me, Mr. President, I lost track of part of the question because I had brought down a copy of the bill that lacked the page 4, where that section was printed on. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
letter I.
Yes, Mr. President. Although, Mr. President, in...
The person subjected or forced to undertake any medical or psychological examination
Yes.
or determine or alter the person's SOGI is a minor,
Yes.
the approval of the appropriate court is required. Paki-explica sa amin yan. Bakit family court? Bakit hindi magulang? Minor eh. Or yung legal guardian. Subjected or forced to undertake any medical or psychological examination.
Yes. Yes, Mr. President. The parents or the legal guardians will also be asked to weigh in as the persons in whose authority the person involved, who is a minor, is placed. And the appropriate family court will be the forum or the space where this prior approval shall be required. It's also the case, Mr. President, that unfortunately, sometimes parents force the child to undertake an examination. And in such cases, the family court will still request the parents or the legal guardians to weigh in, but somehow it will also provide some kind of guidance or some kind of, how would you say, some kind of care expressed through the court for the minor concerned.
I can accept your answer and explanation, but where can I find it here in the law? That the parents or the legal guardian will be consulted.
I would be open, Mr. President, to, at the proper time, accepting an amendment to this section to make that more specific. The participation of the parents or legal guardians of the child or of the minor person involved.
All right, just before we leave this point, can you give me an example of what you mean by a medical or psychological examination to determine or alter the person's SOGI? Can you give me a specific example, Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. President. Unfortunately, one of the saddest and most traumatic examples, for example, of a psychological examination would be that related to what is called electric conversion therapy, where the premise, the psychological or medical premise, is that the child's SOGI, which may not be what was assigned to him or her at birth, is different from his actual orientation and identity or expression, but that is treated as a disorder and something to be treated or cured through psychological first examination as if a diagnosis of an illness, and then that electrical conversion therapy to switch. Yes, Mr. President. And I mentioned that this is one of the saddest and most traumatic examples because electric conversion therapy causes trauma, and yet it is still applied in some cases because of the belief that electricity can biologically change gender identity.
So that's the reason you are putting the family courts first before the parents, because usually the parents do not accept the preferred gender of the person. Am I right?
Actually, Mr. President, I am hoping that as time has passed and there has been so much advocacy on the part of gender sensitivity and equality advocates, including the LGBT community, I'm hoping, in fact, that it's no longer usual or predominantly that families do not accept their child's SOGI. Hopefully, over time, slowly, even more families are accepting this. But even in this, even in exceptions, or especially in exceptions, it would not be the case in this section that of putting the family court first as as Mr. President has expressed it, first than the parents or the legal guardians, but providing a space where, if the opposite case were true, that the parents or the legal guardians would force the child to be examined, even through such traumatic therapies as electric conversion therapy, that the family court would provide the child a safe space to be heard also, alongside the testimony of the parents. Mr. President, in family court proceedings, in the rules of court, parents and guardians are called as a matter of course. So the rules of court for family court proceedings, which are, like all existing laws, not to be amended or affected by this bill.
But then again, the example you're giving is that if a parents or a parent would want his or her son or daughter to undertake such a proceeding, he or she, the parent, even though the child is a minor, must seek the permission of a family court.
Such therapies are listed under examples of discriminatory practices, and that is why it is proposed that in such cases, the prior approval of the appropriate family court shall be required. If the minor disapproves the procedure, then yes, family court will be the next step. So as to provide a space where both the child who is refusing to undergo the therapy and the parents or the legal guardians are insisting upon it may both be heard equally and then resolved by the family court.
Medyo, I understand your point, but I find it a little touchy, Magulang, gusto kong subukan na itong anak ko ay mag-undergo nitong procedure na to na baka sakaling ang gender niya ay mapanigan niya ang isang gender, no? But I have to seek the family court's permission, although he's a minor.
Yes, Mr. President, and it is because of the premise of the bill itself that a person's sexual orientation and gender identity or expression, whether LGBT or straight, is inherent to that person's life as a human being. That, in effect, as Lady Gaga sang, we are born this way. And that if a child is saying, this is my sexual orientation, this is my gender identity and expression, then most probably such an individual, like I, a straight woman, would probably say, no, I do not accept to undergo any therapy to change my SOGI because I was born this way. It is not only a matter of choice, but it is a matter of realization of who and how I am as a human being.
So
now,
even
when
if,
the person
even
is,
if the person is
yes,
a minor,
Mr. President.
Even if the person is a minor,
Yes,
that's
Mr.
what we're saying
President.
here.
In fact, Mr. President, because of our human consciousness, and we are almost all of us, or all of us are parents in this chamber, we know that when our child reaches, say, age 2 and becomes verbal, he or she becomes capable of naming experiences, later on remembering them. And of course, the experiences closest to our, experience and our hearts are the experiences of who am I and how do I relate with other people. And then especially when the child goes through adolescence, again, a very key period of human development, that further the child becomes aware of who he or she is in his own self and in her own relations with other people. So yes, Mr. President, even at the tender age, even at a young age, certainly each one of us, whether we straights or LGBTs, become aware of who we are and
All
how
right.
we are.
Let's be very specific.
Yes,
Because the minority leader is asking me if how many cases do we have of this sort in the Philippines. But before you answer that, let's give a specific example. A 7-year-old boy acts like he is a girl. The mother and the father would like to try a scientific procedure that would probably alter his thinking. He's 7 years old. How will he go to the family courts and tell them, and the parents will be bringing him. So, paano yun?
Kung paano po yun, Mr. President, first of all, importante po yung halimbawa mo that the child is 7 years old. Child psychologists and psychiatrists will tell us parents that 7 is the so-called age of reason, that the child becomes much more cognitive, can discern himself or herself.
Sige. The minority leader is saying below 7, 5.
5 years
5 years
old.
old.
Well, as I was saying earlier, Mr. President, even at 2, a child starts to become verbal and therefore capable of naming, assigning meaning and value, and then later remembering experiences, including experiences of knowing himself or relating with her family members and playmates.
All right. Yeah, I'm specifically trying to get to the point of bringing it to the family courts
Yes.
instead of the parents deciding it.
Yes.
How will the 5-year-old go to the family court?
Well, probably, Mr. President, we would have to work that out in the IRRs as well, because, for example, in the example I gave earlier of electric conversion therapy, that would be applied by the child psychologist or psychiatrist, and it might be possible to name certain professionals who would be accountable to make sure that the family goes through that process first in the family court. And of course, Mr. President, another important group of professionals who could be stakeholders in this bill or this proposed law would be social workers. Also, Mr. President, I'm glad that we are also spending time referring to my example of electric conversion therapy, because the trauma that I mentioned earlier from electric conversion therapy is damaging and irreversible. And in
Okay.
such cases, the child's vulnerability is foremost, especially since we are upholding the principle of the best interests of the child.
When did the electric conversion therapy reach the Philippine shores? Mr. President, Your Honor.
Mr. President, I'll be very glad to get back to you on that, the specific year that electric conversion authority therapy
Okay.
reached the Philippines. As of now, there is no data in hard numbers on psychological therapies because of deep stigma. Deep stigma about bringing a child to a child psychologist or psychiatrist to quote-unquote cure him or her of a SOGI that is different from what was assigned to him or her at birth. But repeated reports from especially the LGBT communities say that the impact is deep. There was no mechanism to protect them from the acts of their own parents.
Would you have statistics on how many persons have undergone electric conversion therapy already in the Philippines?
In the same light, Mr. President, no data in hard numbers on this specific psychological therapy of electric conversion therapy,
we-
precisely because of the deep stigma. But we have repeated anecdotal reports from the communities who experience this and who recount this these have gone into their documentation of the past 17 years that we have been advocating a SOGI-based anti-discrimination bill.
What are there hospitals or clinics that have this electric conversion therapy? procedure in the Philippines? How many are
Yes,
they?
Mr. President. Hospitals and, again, unfortunately, religious groups, which yes, and again, Mr. President, no data in terms of hard numbers on such therapies applied or administered by hospitals and religious groups because of the deep stigma.
Can we find out more? Please, can your committee look into this and let us have more empirical data on this so that when we formulate our amendment, we can be very, we will have enough information to formulate, because at the outset, right now, offhand, I'm thinking of proposing that the parents come first and secondary yung courts. But because of your explanation, I'm having second thoughts, but I'd like to have more empirical data or statistics before doing that. So I hope you can favor us with your committee looking into this matter and informing us as soon as possible.
I will certainly do that, Mr. President. And again, the reason that the family courts are contemplated to come into the picture at all is that, unfortunately, there have been cases where, yes, of course, as in all our families, the parents come first, but unfortunately, there are these cases that parents themselves request or approve of such therapies on their children. And there are other therapies, Mr. President, not just this electrical conversion therapy. This electrical therapy is only the extreme example. And again, documentation is hard to present because people don't want to reveal themselves.
Anyway, thank you very much for that, Mr. President. Nevertheless, I'm glad that you have mentioned and are availing of the family courts for this particular point. Just for the record, the Republic Act 8369, which creates the family courts, is the principal author is yours truly, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President. I appreciate your questioning,
Thank you.
especially because of that.
Mr. President, moving on, paragraph H of the same section states that it shall be unlawful for any person, natural or juridical, to, quote, deny a person access to or the use of establishments, facilities, utilities, or services, including housing, open to the general public on the basis of SOGI.
Yes.
Now, question, does this include comfort rooms in any establishments, schools, offices, and the like?
Yes, Mr. President.
It does.
Yes, it does, Mr. President. Earlier, in earlier interpellation, I believe also with the good gentlewoman from Bicol, Senator De Lima, I had enumerated several cases of discrimination in the Philippines, including denial of entry to establishments. The case of television personality Inday Garutay, who was allegedly barred entry to a fine dining restaurant because of cross-dressing. And similarly, Bibi Gandanghari also denied entry to an establishment for cross-dressing. But particularly on the matter of bathrooms,
Comfort rooms,
yes,
Mr. President.
Mr.
I'm very,
comfort
very,
rooms, Mr. President.
I'm very concerned about the issue of comfort rooms, Mr. President, because I think this could be prone to abuse by some scoundrels who might use this as a means to perpetrate crimes against chastity. You know, they can, or acts of lasciviousness or seduction, abduction. You know, for example, a male who has a lewd and lascivious behavior can try to cross-dress or dress like a woman so that he can enter a lady's room and commit his desired crime. What prevents this then, Mr. President?
Mr. President, on the issue of what I call trans-inclusive bathrooms, fears against trans people using bathrooms consistent to their gender identity need to be put in context. First, it makes sense. Trans-inclusive bathrooms make sense to people of different biological makeup. In the U.S., for example, which is one of the countries which first started to build segregated bathrooms, their segregated bathrooms were first required not because of biological differences, but because of the notion that women are weaker and needed protection from men. And then segregation in bathrooms needed protection from men. Second point, Mr. President, the idea that trans people will sexually assault people in the bathrooms. This is an assumption that trans people are sexual predators.
No. I'm not talking about transgenders or
Yes.
transsexual people. I'm talking about males.
Straight
who
males,
will-
Mr.
Who
President.
will dress up like a woman just to to enter a woman's comfort room.
Well, in that case, Mr. President,
How can we prevent that?
if a male person cross-dresses to perpetrate crimes, there are already enough laws in the penal code against acts of lasciviousness.
Oh, but
And
the
these
crime
laws,
has been done.
but these laws do not contradict and are not contradicted by our contemplation
I
of a
agree.
SOGI-based anti-discrimination
I
bill.
agree, Mr. President,
Yes,
but the
Mr.
crime has
President.
the damage has already been done. What I'm saying is that this phrase is too open for abuse.
In a-
Deny a person access to the use of establishment, facilities, utilities, or services, including housing, open to the general public on the basis of SOGI, and you say comfort rooms
Yes,
are
Mr.
included.
President. Yes.
Nakakatakot ito.
Mr. President,
You cannot prevent unless we find something or a way to be able to revise this subject provision that will prevent such the incident that I'm saying. And this could happen all over the country. Napakadaling mangyayari ngayon sapagkat papayagan natin ang mga cross-dressers na pumasok sa ladies' room.
Mr. President, for example, just to be a little more specific, in a school setting, it is known among the student population who among friends at least, and among classmates or batchmates, schoolmates, it is known among them who of them are straight, who are LGBT, who are cross-dressing because they are transgender students. And it would be possible to work out in the IRRs as well, for example, that it would be reflected in the students' handbooks that only those who are known as one or the other SOGI would actually have access to the trans-inclusive bathrooms. And at the proper time, Mr. President, I would be open to exploring a more specific formulation to one of the provisions in the bill that would address the concern of the good majority leader.
Yes, please.
Mr. President.
I will lead that particular topic now, but I hope you can look into that. And I
Yes,
do
Mr.
not
President.
agree that we leave this to the IIR or things like this to the IIRs. I have had sad experiences with IRRs for so many laws already in the past.
Yes, Mr. President. That's why I said I would be willing to explore an amendment to the bill proper itself.
All right. Thank you for that, Mr. President. Now, among the items under Section 5, and still Section 5 of the proposed bill, Paragraph K is the one I'm most concerned about. At the same time, curious, as if, it seems that it is a catch-all provision that can really be subject to abuse. Doon lang naman ako nag-aalala sa subject to abuse. Your intention, I agree, but we have to be very careful. Now, can you give us concrete examples of cases falling under this provision of letter A? Letter K. Because does this provision suggest that same-sex marriage may now be allowed in the country?
Not at all, Mr. President.
No,
I can
the
tell you
answer
that
is
very
no.
categorically. No.
very
And
good.
on that specific topic, The bill clearly states that what should constitute as discriminatory is to deny or to revoke only professional license of anyone because of his or her SOGI. There is nothing in the bill that changes the provision in, I'm just turning to the correct page, Mr. President. It's okay. There's nowhere in the bill which amends Article 1 of the Family Code
All right.
defining marriage as a special contract between a man and a woman. The Anti-discrimination Bill only aims to prohibit discriminatory practices in schools, workplace, healthcare, public service, and other violation of fundamental rights. A separate bill on marriage equality would need to be filed to address the concern of the good majority leader.
All right, very good. I'm glad you placed that on record, that
Yes, Mr.
particular
President.
answer. Now, kasi I recall last Monday, you mentioned in your opening statement that, quote, people should not be discriminated against because of who they love.
Yes, Mr. President. Thank you
Now-
so much for repeating that.
Yeah, so because there are penalties for the penalties that you are imposing in this bill. I think that acts under Section 5 must be made clear and very specific. That's the reason I brought this out, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President. What I said about no person should be penalized for whom he or she loves was a general expression of the spirit of the bill. But the very particular prohibited acts and eventually penalties are those explicitly articulated in the body of the bill itself.
All right. Now, during the interpellation of Senator De Lima, you stated, quote, I don't think you mean this way, but this is the quote. Cross-dressing would fall under the prohibited acts of this bill. What do you
I
mean by
certainly
this?
didn't
Does
mean it that way, Mr.
You
President.
didn't mean it that way. You mean that
I meant it will...
any
cross-dressing is not
individual or
prohibited.
entity that disallows cross-dressing would be penalized under the proposed bill. Is that right?
Yes, Mr.
Right,
President.
yeah. So mali lang yung
Either mali po
rinig
yung
namin.
pagkasabi ko or mali po yung pagdinig mo.
Well, we looked at the journal eh. We looked
baka
at the
mali po yung
journal.
pagdinig ng mga
Baka hindi lang
sa
tama yung context ng
baka
pagkakasabi.
mali po yung pagkabigkas ko.
Nevertheless, I understand your point. Ano ha?
Opo.
Yeah, I understand your point. Now, if this is so, and what you're saying is, we will disallow any individual or entity. No, any individual or entity will not be allowed to disallow. Correct, cross-dressing, and they would be penalized. Ganon po?
They would be penalized for
If they are not- if-
doing discriminatory acts against a person because of his or her cross-dressing, which is one example of his or her gender expression.
Okay, now, how do we reconcile this with the educational institutions' academic freedom, which has been enshrined in Section 5, Paragraph 2 of the 1987 Constitution, as well as the right of the court to supervise and regulate the practice of law, which includes the conduct of lawyers through the implementation of a dress code? Note, Your Honor, Mr. President, a concrete example is the academic freedom issue that has been provided in the case of the Ateneo de Manila University versus Capullo. To wit, quote, private schools have the right to establish reasonable rules and regulations for the admission, discipline, and promotion of students. Now, to continue, sa courts naman, Rule 11.01 of the Lawyer's Code of Professional Responsibility states that a lawyer shall appear in court properly attired. What if a lawyer comes in cross-dressed?
That is an interesting scenario, Mr. President. And I think it would be a very positive challenge to our judiciary in the Philippines to themselves examine how gender-sensitive and gender-fair our highest court would be. And particularly, Mr. President, to your question about school uniforms. Educational institutions and offices are, of course, allowed to maintain uniforms and dress codes to serve as an identifier for their members, to highlight their different roles, and for some, a safety requirement. But the requirements of uniforms and dress codes should be consistent with students' or employees' gender identity or gender expression. And as I expressed to the good gentlewoman from Bicol, Senator De Lima, in her interpellation, the Far Eastern University, for example, has recently allowed its students to wear the uniform they are most comfortable with. This should create a more inclusive environment where students can be more comfortable with themselves, which should allow them to excel in their studies. And more on uniforms, Mr. President. Trans people should be respected for who they are. If trans people are happier with the gender they identify with, schools should be able to accommodate that in the interest of students' welfare and happiness.
But it violates the issue of academic freedom of the institution, the educational institutions, like what happened in Ateneo.
Actually,
So what if my alma mater and the alma mater of Senator Gordon in the elementary grades, Letran, disallows a cross-dresser from entering school because he is wearing a bare midrib. Ano? Ang skimpy yung shorts.
well, that would probably, Mr. President, fall under dress codes. Most or all schools would say to come to class in appropriate attire, not revealing clothes. And there are a lot of cross-dressing dress styles that would fall under this appropriate clothing for studies. And in the case of your alma mater, if that were the case, then they would be failing to live up to the standard that is already beginning to be set, for example, by FEU. The principle of academic freedom, Mr. President, it is precisely for the academic institution to provide an atmosphere conducive for the intellectual exploration and learning of the student. And I would say academic freedom is even primarily for the exercise and responsible enjoyment of the students, including wearing the clothes in which he or she is most comfortable to study in.
All right, you're saying that the school has a conduct or a dress code that they should follow.
Yes,
And
Mr.
then,
President.
but they should be open to somebody who would cross-dress and enter the school premises. Now, if the school does not allow, your bill gives the person, I'm talking about the student, the right to charge them. And you're going to give penalties of 1 year to 12 years imprisonment, 100,000 to 500,000 fine. This
Yes,
is the
Mr.
next
President.
point that I'm worried about, Mr. President. So, pwedeng gamitin ito. Pwede na naman gamitin ito nung kung sino man yun na hindi papayagang pumasok sa eskwelahan sapagkat napaka-skimpy nung suot niya or alam na lalaki siya, nakabihis siya ng babae.
Again, Mr. President, the bill is not contemplating students of whatever soji going to school in inappropriate, meaning skimpy attire. But it seeks to, yes, certain situations may boil down to the student, the student who feels offended, bringing his or her school to court. But it is precisely because the bill seeks to provide protection against discrimination. And I do respectfully understand, Mr. President, that this continues to be a debate. But that is how we are challenged to evolve. In the past, academic freedom was also invoked to prevent blacks from studying alongside whites in the United States. Legislation in their country helped create a better society, and that is also what we hope for through this bill, Mr. President.
All right. Before I go to that particular provision that I just mentioned about the fines and imprisonment, really, this is something, what the issue I brought about earlier should be something that your committee should really study, especially the lawyer's code on professionalism. Pag pinayagan natin to, you're saying that it's up to the courts now kung papayagan nila. Let's say a lawyer comes in cross-dressed.
Well,
Hindi papayagan ng judge. With our bill, and if it becomes a law, he can charge the judge. He can judge the judge, and the judge can be fined 100,000 to 500,000 or imprisonment of 1 to 12 years.
a transgender person going to court cross-dressed, why not, Mr. President? If he or she has come with the best interests of his or her clients in mind, has come well prepared to argue his side of the case or her side, if that person, regardless of his SOGI, but happening to be cross-dressing, relates to the judge or the justice with all the respect due that superior judicial person's rank above him or her as a lawyer, I think the dress would be, in fact, immaterial. Simply the personal expression of an individual, not demeaning at all his or her common profession with the sitting judge or justice.
You asked why not?
Yes, Mr. President.
Because Rule 11 of the Lawyer's Code of Professional Responsibility states that it cannot. So we are going to violate rules of court
Well, Mr.
by
President,
allowing cross-dressing in court.
well, I will study that further, Mr. President, but of course, in all of our bills, we have a repealing clause that all laws, decrees, orders, rules, and regulations or parts thereof inconsistent with this act are hereby repealed or modified accordingly. And additionally, Mr. President, the appropriateness of uniform need not even be gendered. It can be gender-neutral clothing also, the way eventually in casual settings or social settings, jeans are now accepted as appropriate to both men and women, Mr. President.
Anyway, I don't think the lawyers in the hall will agree with that, Mr. President.
I would
don't
love to
think so.
take a survey, Mr. President.
I'm sure. I am very sure that majority of the lawyers in the gallery, in the hall, will not be favoring that particular point. Anyway, again, on the issue of discrimination,
Yes.
in your definition at the start, pasok ba dito yung biruan?
Sir?
Biruan,
Mr. President?
yung biro.
Biro.
Yes, like for example,
Depends kung anong klaseng biro po.
let me be very specific, like calling somebody bading. Is that going to be
Is that to be
discriminatory?
prohibited?
Huh?
Will that be prohibited?
That's what I'm asking.
Yes, Mr. President, I would like to refer you, Mr. President, to Section 5, Discriminatory Practices. Letter A, it shall be unlawful for any person, natural or juridical, to A, promote and encourage stigma on the basis of SOGI in the media, in educational textbooks, and other medium, inciting violence and sexual abuse against any person or group on the basis of SOGI is likewise prohibited.
So does it fall under that? You
Yes, Mr.
categorized it under
President.
promote and encourage stigma? Like
Yes,
for
Mr.
example,
President.
it could not be stigma to somebody who acknowledges that he is a gay person. Like for
That is
example,
true, Mr.
in our
President,
television
but-
program, Alan Kay, Alan Kilantang or Alan Kay, he finds it funny when we call him bading. So are we going to be
I can
penalized for that?
respect his sentiment, Mr. President, but there are also many gay people who wouldn't mind at all being called gay, but bading at this point in time in our country has a very strong derogatory connotation and is
Well, on the
employed against a
contrary.
gay man with a not positive, with a negative intent.
On the
Mr.
contrary, Mr. President, Alan Kay does not prefer to be called bakla. He'd rather be called bading. I know many others who feel the same way. So, and it's to them, it's a common thing. Now, example, let's say somebody posts a picture in internet or in Instagram or Twitter of say 2 or 3 gay people scantily dressed, and I write something, or I laugh at it, or I find it funny, or give a comment. Is that discriminatory?
Mr. President, before I answer that particular point, please just allow me to return to the example of Mr. Alan Kay. If he's not offended, then he won't file a complaint or a case. The bill gives an avenue for redress who feel that their rights are violated.
So only if you are
And-
offended.
Yes, Mr. President. As you said, Mr. President, he does not feel offended.
Pero
So it
kung
is
gustong
determined by the
abusuhin,
person.
Kung
Mr.
inis
President?
sa'yo, even if it's not offensive, gagawin niyang offensive. But I think we
I
have to
beg
be
your pardon,
very
Mr.
careful.
President?
I said, I think we have to be very careful about this, because it could be non-offensive at all, no, but it could be a joke. But if that person suddenly wants to get back at you or dislikes you, can make a big fuss out of it.
I would
You know,
rather...
it's also easy, you know.
I rather return, Mr. President, to the sense of your earlier phrase that he doesn't feel offended.
Yeah, he does that.
Yes, Mr. President. And that is a decisive feature of identification of acts of discrimination, how the person feels. In the same way that how I know my sexual orientation or my gender identity and expression is, in layperson's language, a matter of how I feel. And so in a certain context, at this point in time in our country, it is the person of whatever soji who determines whether he has been discriminated against or his right
offended or
has
not.
been violated.
All right.
Can the
And
chair,
then-
can the chair intervene and ask a very specific question?
Yes, Mr.
Did I hear
President.
you say, Madam Sponsor, that it is up to, who's the?
The person.
The person. Well, if he does not feel offended,
Yes.
well, he doesn't have to file a case.
Yes, he will not, in fact.
Now, can somebody else file a case?
Yun.
No, Mr. President. Only the
Huh?
person himself or herself.
Only the person himself.
Yes, Mr.
So it
President.
is,
Unless a minor, Mr. President.
yeah, all right. So this is in law what we call a private offense, meaning only the offended party can file it.
Yes, Mr. President, it would be a private offense.
Is that here in the bill?
Okay. It is
Yeah.
not in the bill at present, Mr. President, but the complainant would have to be the person in interest in the
I'm
situation.
sorry, the complainant?
Person in interest? It's not, what the Mr. President has asked is not in the bill at present, but the person who would file a complaint or even a case would have to be the offended party.
Right, is that in the bill? Because that's very important, that if it is a private offense, then correct, only the offended party can file.
Yes, Mr.
But
President.
if there is no such qualification in the bill, a law enforcement officer can file.
I would be open to accepting an amendment regarding this concern at the proper time, Mr. President. And I'd just like to add at this point, Mr. President, that the greater harm in these situations, which we've been talking about as examples, the greater harm is the systemic prejudice against LGBT. And maybe this bill will also help each one of us to be more watchful in our of our language.
Well, yes, but it really depends on the person. I I distinctly remember. It depends if you're offended or not. You see, the other day there was a rumor that among us male here there is a gay member of the Senate.
Maybe, Mr.
So
President.
they asked Senator Honasan who it was. Of course, I heard the answer of Senator Nasan. I think you'd better ask him instead, but not you. Perhaps Senator Drilon can ask Senator Nasan, who is that particular person?
Well, women are just as capable of asking such questions, Mr.
No,
President.
no. The answer does not fit a woman asking. But if Senator Nasan will favor us, ako na lang. Would you know, Your Honor, Mr. President, would
Mr.
Senator
President.
Nasan know who that particular person here in the Senate who is gay?
Mr. President, with the permission of a good gentle lady and the
Yes,
majority
Mr.
floor leader,
President.
my name was alluded to. But the standard answer of the majority floor leader when asked was, I know who the person suspected is, pero kiss mo na. Thank you, Mr. President.
I think, dear Mr. President, I think this is an example of why such a bill is important to us.
Anyway, Mr. President, moving on. Another provision that I mentioned earlier that I believe needs to be looked at is Section 7 on penalties.
Yes.
In your proposed measure, the penalties provided is ranging from 100,000 to 500,000, depending on the act committed, or an imprisonment of 1 year to 12 years, again, depending on the act committed. My question is that, don't you see this as very harsh or excessive, being not commensurate to the acts committed? Like, just to give you a clearer picture on or where I'm coming from and why I'm asking this, the following crimes are punishable by imprisonment of 1 to 12 years. In the case of U.S. Marine Joseph Scott Pemberton for
Exactly,
killing the
Mr.
Filipino
President.
transgender. 1 to 12 years imprisonment, 6 years to 12 years nga, and then lowered to 6 to 10. Adultery and concubinage, direct bribery, malversation of funds and property, serious physical injuries. Senator Nasan was charged with this before. Slavery, some cases of robbery with violence against or intimidation of persons. This merit imprisonment of 1 to 12 years. So yung act of discriminating because you dislike the dress of somebody who cross-dresses, your penalties can range from 1 to 12 years.
Yes, sir, Mr. President. And I thank the good majority leader for, in fact, mentioning first, also the first case of discrimination among the cases that I presented to the good gentlewoman from Bicol, Senator De Lima, during her interpellation, precisely the case of Jennifer Laude, who was found dead in the bathroom of a motel room in Olongapo City. The man who allegedly left her in that state being U.S. Marine Lance Corporal Joseph Scott Pemberton, who Olongapo RTC Branch 74 found guilty of homicide,
Homicide,
and who
yes.
was sentenced to 6 to 12 years of imprisonment. So yes, Mr. President, the bill contemplates prohibited acts and appropriate penalties that go all the way up to what was done to Jennifer Laude as a case of SOGI-based discrimination.
All right. Mr. President, I submit that the discriminatory practices provided in the bill really are not as serious as the crimes I cited, no? And they warrant a penalty of such imprisonment up to 12 years. Moreover, the penalty provided in a law similar to this proposed measure, which is the Magna Carta for Women, is only to pay for damages.
Is what?
So, damages lang. So the second paragraph of Section 41 of the said law states it. You can check it out. The Magna Carta for Women. Damages lang eh. Oh, nakalagay, if the violation is committed by a private entity or individual, the person directly responsible for the violation shall be liable to pay damages. Bakit dito 1 to 12 years imprisonment? 100,000 to 500,000 fine, hindi ba masyadong discriminatory
Well,
itong
again,
batas na to?
of course, Mr. President, no anti-discrimination bill would want to commit discrimination itself, and that's why I appreciated the point about this bill seeking to protect not just LGBTs, but any and all individuals of whatever SOGI. So we just wanted to emphasize the gravity of discrimination and its deep effects, and which in fact could go all the way to the case of Jennifer Laude, also cited by the good majority leader. And I would be willing to consider amendments to this section on penalties at the proper time. Regarding the observations of the good majority leader on the Magna Carta of women, at the same time, many laws protect women that have penal provisions. For example, the Violence Against Women and Their Children Act, which was at isa po itong parang naging anak din ng Magna Carta of Women. Sa LGBT, wala pa po. Wala pang protective law na may penal provision.
During the committee hearings, just for my final point,
Yes, Mr.
were you able to consult private individuals or entities, particularly on the discriminatory practices?
Yes, we were,
May I know-
Mr. President.
May I know their comments on these provisions?
One which comes immediately to mind is the Catholic Educational Association of the Philippines. We invited them, they participated in the hearing. And ano yung particular concern? PIMA? Yes, and their concern was similar to what the good majority leader raised on the issue of uniforms. And another private organization, Mr. President, the PMAP, or Professional Management or Managers, Professional Managers Association of the Philippines, and their concern was, on the hiring and human resources aspects or
I have no
effects
problem
of
with
this
that.
bill.
There
Thank you,
should
Mr.
really be
President.
no discrimination as far as that is concerned.
Yes, Mr. President.
Anyway, were there reservations on the bill?
Yes.
Aside
By
from
those
the-
two organizations, Mr. President, of SEAP and PIMAP.
Those two?
Yes, Mr. President.
All right. All right. Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank the distinguished lady for answering my questions and the points that we raised. And hopefully, during the period of amendments, we can come up with some proposals that will be acceptable to the committee. Thank you, Mr.
I
President.
look forward to that, Mr. President, especially since the good majority leader signed the committee report.
Yes,
Thank you
Mr.
so much, good majority leader.
You're welcome. Mr. President, may we now recognize Senator Greg Honasan to continue the interpellation.
Senator Greg Honasan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Madam Sponsor, will the good sponsor tolerate just a few comments? And first, I want
More
to
than
apologize.
tolerate, Mr. President.
Let me start by apologizing. Although it took a lot of provocation from the majority floor leader to, but I entered that into the record in good faith.
Thank you, Mr. President.
My concerns would be limited to first, well, I have already heard the good lady sponsor express willingness to accommodate certain suggestions during the period of amendments.
Yes, Mr. President.
That would be my first point. Second is, let me go back to the issue of lawyers appearing cross-dressed in the courtrooms and students attending classes cross-dressed. Does the good lady sponsor contemplate a mechanism where we can prepare the ground? Because if you look at the family code, my thinking is that we cannot give what we do not have. If this issue is not settled in our most basic and strongest fundamental economic, social, and political unit, I think the variables will increase as we bring it outside the ambit of the family environment. So my question related to both the courts and the academic environment is, does the good lady sponsor contemplate that this might provide an unwelcome distraction that will impair the dispensation of justice? I'm just looking at it from a very practical viewpoint. If a lawyer appears in court cross-dressed, baka ho Madam Sponsor, ma-distract yung korte. If we bring that to the academic environment, when students appear cross-dressed, baka naman ho ma-impair yung learning process, which brings us to the issue of our priorities. So I just put that on the table, and I would ask very briefly an insight from the lady sponsor. Para the question of timing eventually will be addressed, and I have serious doubts about our ability to calibrate this in a manner that will prepare the mindset of our families, our culture, and welcome this interesting piece of legislation. That constitutes the points I wanted to raise.
Thank you, Mr. President, for the good gentleman's interest in the bill. For two points at first, that access to education should be primordial than any school policy, because when a student does not follow the uniform and is penalized, that student loses access to education, a fundamental right. And in the lawyer's code, all it says is that lawyers should be appropriately dressed. And I did say earlier, Mr. President, that appropriately dressed need not be gendered. It may in fact be gender neutral. In fact, the robes donned by lawyers when they appear before the Supreme Court as a matter of respect to the justices, these could be considered gender neutral. I appreciate so much, Mr. President, the point of the good gentleman about preparing the ground. And as a daughter myself, as a parent myself, I do agree that all changes not just in any institution like the schools or the courts, but in a whole society, that the change has to also start and has to be grounded, rooted in the family. And I think that this has been the case for every, in a way, radical for its time change. I believe, for example, that the shift that the United States was able to make not only in its understanding of academic freedom, but its change of mind about the so-called virtues of the slave system towards what they are continuing to build now, also had to begin and take root in changes in the consciousness of the families. To add to my earlier point about schools, the impaired learning process, which is a concern of the good gentleman, again, this was also invoked before in segregation laws in the United States. But as we know and as we hope, laws evolve, society itself evolves, and legislation can shape society instead of us passively waiting for society to change. And again, I wish to affirm my deep appreciation for the point about preparing the ground, so that in programs to promote non-discrimination and diversity, specifically diversity programs and policies, right now these are contemplated for government agencies, government-owned and controlled corporations, private companies, public and private educational institutions such as the example of FEU I gave earlier, and other entities shall establish diversity programs to ensure that human rights violations and violence on the basis of SOGI are prevented. There's also an item about information and education campaign, and we know that for any program and policy in society, for any information and education campaign, the family is a primary stakeholder and space where we hope that these processes will get underway and bear good fruit.
Thank you, Mr. President. Madam Chair, one last point for my education. Does wearing makeup, constitute cross-dressing?
It could, Mr. President, for a student born male, that's his sex assigned at birth, but through the experience and expression of Soji, identifies and expresses herself as female, and so may cross-dress, and as part of cross-dressing, for example, to school, wear, again, not, over-the-top makeup, but makeup to enhance her looks and make herself feel happier and more disposed to learning.
Madam Chair, thank you for indulging this representation, and thank you for your patience and for accepting my earlier apology. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you so much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Nassan, the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. There are 2 or 3 more members of the Senate who wish to interpolate, so I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 1271 under Committee Report Number 17.
Consideration of the measure is suspended.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adjourn the session until 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Monday, February 13, 2017.
In objection, hearing none, session is adjourned until 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Monday, February 13, 2017.